The silence that once swallowed my family whole has finally been shattered. What was buried beneath decades of fear, lies, and pain is now laid bare, exposed to the light of truth and remembrance. But this is not a story of victims. It is a story of survival, of strength forged in the fires of suffering, and of voices once silenced now rising with a fierce clarity. I carry their stories within me, the whispered fears of Evelyn, the desperate hope of my mother, the unyielding courage of Lily. Their shadows no longer haunt me, instead they fuel the fire burning inside. Each step I take forward honors their struggle and breaks the chains that bound us. The past may have shaped us, but it will no longer define us. In facing the darkest corners of my history, I found light, a light that demands we speak, remember, and never forget. This legacy is now mine to carry, not as a burden but as a beacon. To anyone who has felt lost in the silence, know this: your story matters. Your pain is valid. And through telling your truth, you reclaim your power. The night is darkest just before dawn. And now dawn is breaking. This is the end of one journey, and the beginning of another. I don't remember what exactly led me up to the attic that day. Maybe it was the silence in the house after Mom passed. That suffocating stillness, like the walls themselves were grieving. Maybe I was searching for some leftover piece of her, something she touched, wore, or loved that could remind me she had once been real. Not just a still body in a casket 2 weeks ago. The attic was colder than I remembered. Dust floated like memories in the shafts of light breaking through the small circular window. I hadn't been up there since I was a kid, when I used to beg her to let me play among the boxes and forgotten furniture. She always said no. Her voice was firm, almost panicked whenever I asked. I never understood why. That day I found the answer. Behind an old trunk filled with broken Christmas ornaments, I saw a wooden box, old, carved, and locked with a brass latch. Unlike everything else in the attic, it wasn't covered in dust. That box had been opened, or moved, recently. My hands trembled as I touched it, like some instinct deep inside me knew this wasn't something I was supposed to find. The lock was rusted, but I managed to snap it with a screwdriver. The moment it opened, the scent of something old and bitter filled the air, like time itself had been sealed inside. Inside the box was a single object, wrapped in a yellowed piece of cloth. A diary. Worn leather cover. Pages swollen with age. No name, no title. Just the weight of secrets I hadn't asked to carry. But I opened it, and the first line shattered everything. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or too much of a coward to tell you myself. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I sat there, numb as the attic swallowed me in its silence. I hadn't even turned the page yet, and I already knew. My mother had been hiding a different kind of truth. Not the kind you protect someone from. The kind that rewrites everything. The thing that struck me first, beyond the words, was her handwriting. It wasn't the tidy, careful script I remembered from birthday cards or the notes she used to leave on the fridge. It was uneven, shaky in places, letters pushed together like she was writing in a rush, or under pressure. I ran my fingers along the ink as if by touching it I could feel the weight of her hand again. But there was something else. Something that made me hesitate before turning to the next page. The date. October 17, 1996. I wasn't even born yet. I blinked, confused. I checked the page again, hoping I had read it wrong. But no, this wasn't a diary about me. Not at first. This was something else. A story she had never told. A version of her I had never met. I don't know who I'm writing this for. Myself maybe. Or for you if you ever find it. But I have to get it out before it eats me alive. Because what I did, what happened, it's still in this house. And it's not just mine to carry anymore. A chill moved down my spine. The attic suddenly felt too still, like the air itself had frozen to listen. The next few pages were a blur of emotion. Panic, guilt, confusion. She wrote about a man she couldn't name. Someone she had loved or feared, or maybe both. She never said if he was my father. In fact, she never mentioned me at all. Not yet. But she talked about a child. One she hadn't planned for. One that, according to her words, never made it into the world. I stopped reading. My mind was spinning. My mother had always told me she never wanted children. That I was a surprise she learned to love. She said it in a laughing way, like it was supposed to make me feel special. But what if it was a lie? What if I wasn't her only child? If I wasn't even the first? I sat there in the dust and shadows, Diary open on my lap, the words trembling in my hands. And for the first time since she died, I was terrified of the woman I had called Mom. That night I couldn't sleep. The diary stayed on my nightstand, but it may as well have been pulsing with heat and guilt. Every time I looked at it, I felt like it was staring back at me, daring me to keep reading. I didn't want to. I really didn't. But I also couldn't look away. I turned on the lamp. The house was still, everyone gone. Just me and the pages of a woman I thought I knew. I flipped ahead a few pages, skimming lines, and then a name jumped out like a scream in a quiet room. Jonah. The name was underlined 3 times. The ink smudged, almost as if she'd written it with trembling hands, then tried to wipe it away. Jonah said I'd regret everything. That someday I'd look back and wish I had told the truth. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of myself. But mostly afraid of you. Was she talking to me? Or to someone else? Jonah. I had never heard that name before in my life. She never had friends come over, never spoke about past relationships. There were no old photos, no stories, no letters. My mother was a ghost when it came to her past. And now I knew why. The more I read, the more twisted everything became. She didn't just know Jonah, she was entangled with him. In love. In fear. The lines blurred. One passage stood out more than the others. The night I bled, he wasn't there. He never was when it mattered. I told him about the baby and he laughed. Said I was weak. Said it wasn't his problem. And that's when I knew he would never stop ruining things. I made a decision that night. One I've never spoken aloud. One I never forgave myself for. I stopped breathing. A decision? What kind of decision? And then another line, buried halfway down the page, hit me like a slap. But even after all these years, I still don't know if Jonah ever told her the truth. Someone else knew. Someone out there. Someone my mother had tried to erase, but couldn't. My chest tightened. A pressure I couldn't explain built behind my ribs. I had lived my whole life thinking I was an only child. That I was the one who carried her last name, her legacy, her grief. But what if I wasn't the only one? What if someone out there had the same blood running through their veins, and had no idea? I closed the diary. Not because I was done, but because I wasn't ready for what came next. I didn't touch the diary the next morning. Not right away. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring out the window, watching the wind stir the branches of the oak tree in the backyard. That tree had been there since before I was born. It had held up every tire swing, every carved initial, every summer memory like a guardian. But now it felt like a witness, like it had known the whole time. By noon I gave in. I brought the diary back downstairs and sat with it in the living room. This time I didn't flip through pages. I let it fall open naturally, as if the diary itself wanted me to read something specific. It landed on a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 entries. A letter. No envelope. No greeting. Just a single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased, with a paragraph written in the same handwriting as the diary. But something about it felt different. Colder. More direct. You said you'd keep the secret. You said you'd bury it like we agreed. So why am I hearing whispers now? Why did someone come to the door asking questions about a girl who doesn't exist? You promised me. Don't make me come back there. I stared at it, the words tightening around my chest like a rope. A girl who doesn't exist? Who was this addressed to? And who had come to the door? I checked the date on the back of the letter. January 2007. I was 10. That was the year she pulled me out of school for 2 weeks without explanation. I remember asking her if we were going on vacation and she snapped. She never snapped. Her hand trembled when she packed our bags. I thought she was just tired. But now I wondered if she was running. Running from Jonah. From a past that refused to stay buried. If she ever finds out what we did, one line in the diary read later, it won't just destroy me, it'll destroy everything. Who is she? The same girl mentioned in the letter? The same person my mother had tried so hard to erase? Was she still out there? And what exactly had they done? I didn't realize I was crying until the page blurred beneath my eyes. I wasn't sure if it was grief or rage or fear anymore. Maybe all 3. All I knew was this. I didn't know my mother at all. And someone out there did. That night I dreamed of her. Not my mother. Her. The girl the letter mentioned. The girl my mother was terrified of. In the dream I was back in the attic, only it wasn't the same. The light was gone. Everything was submerged in shadow, and I could hear a slow, steady heartbeat echoing from somewhere deeper inside the walls. I turned to leave, but the attic door was gone. And then I saw her. She stood in the corner facing away from me. Long dark hair. Shoulders slumped. Small, maybe younger than me. She didn't speak. But somehow I heard her say one thing. "I waited for you." I woke up gasping, tangled in the sheets, my throat raw like I'd been screaming. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and reopened the diary. I didn't even think this time. I just started reading page after page front to back like I was starving for it. Every line tore something loose in me. My mother's voice, no longer gentle, no longer maternal, felt like a stranger whispering through the cracks in my memory. There was a time I thought I could live with it. Pretend it never happened. But she was always there, in the edges. Every reflection, every silence. I could feel her. Like she never really left. Like she never forgave me. The next pages described a night my mother had never mentioned. A night she met Jonah in the woods outside the old farm on Hollow Creek Road. She didn't say why they went there, but she did say this. "We buried the box near the well. He told me it was safer that way. That no one would ever find it. But I've never stopped hearing it. Like something inside it still breathes." A box. Buried? By the well. That wasn't metaphor. I knew that place. My grandparents used to own a farmhouse on Hollow Creek Road. We sold it when I was a teenager after my grandmother died. But I still remembered the well out back. I used to drop pennies in it and make wishes, not knowing what lay beneath. My skin turned to ice. Had someone, been buried there? I kept reading. I told him it wasn't right. That it wasn't our decision to make. But he told me it was too late. That no one would believe me. That if I spoke they'd blame me, not him. And maybe he was right. My hands trembled. I dropped the diary. I couldn't breathe. What was she talking about? What did they do? And then I saw something written in the margins of the page I hadn't noticed before. Scratched in so lightly it was nearly invisible under normal light. "You'll know her by the scar on her shoulder." Scar. The girl in the dream had a scar. I didn't see it directly, but something about the way her shirt slipped off her shoulder. Something unnatural, a line of raised skin, pale and old and silent. That's when the truth started to settle into the pit of my stomach like a dead weight. She wasn't a metaphor. She wasn't a symbol. She was real. She was a child. A child who had been silenced, erased, forgotten. And now, after all these years, she was pushing her way back through the walls of my mother's diary, through my dreams, through the cracks in everything I thought I knew. And the worst part? I didn't know if she was alive. Or something else entirely. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Not about the diary, not about the name Jonah, not about the letter or the dream. It wasn't that I didn't want to, it was that I couldn't. How do you start that conversation? "Hey, turns out my dead mother was hiding the existence of a girl with a scar on her shoulder who may or may not be buried under a well on an old farm we sold years ago. There are some truths that don't survive daylight. Some that you can't unsay." And so I kept pretending. I smiled at my coworkers. I nodded along with old friends who reached out after the funeral. I even went back to the cemetery and stood by my mother's grave, staring at the polished stone and the dates engraved beneath her name like they meant something. Like they told her story. But the truth was, the version of her that had died wasn't the one I was grieving anymore. It was the illusion. The mother I thought I had. The woman who made pancakes on Saturdays and hummed old records while folding laundry. That version of her was gone, and what remained in her place was this shadow. This voice that lingered on paper and in nightmares and in places I hadn't dared to look. I started dreaming of the girl more often. Sometimes she was in my house, walking just ahead of me, always out of reach. Sometimes she stood at the foot of my bed, head tilted, lips parted like she was trying to speak but couldn't remember how. But always, I woke up with the echo of her breath in my ear. It didn't feel like grief anymore. Felt like being haunted. I knew I had to go back to the farm. It had been years since I'd been there, and when I drove down the cracked dirt road that led to the property, a sense of dread curled in my stomach like a fist. The house was still standing, though barely. The paint peeled in long strips, the shutters hung loose, and the porch creaked with the weight of time. Whoever bought it after us clearly hadn't kept it up. Maybe they hadn't even lived in it at all. I parked at the edge of the property and made my way to the back, past the overgrown garden and the skeletal remains of the chicken coop. The well stood exactly where I remembered, half hidden behind a row of dead shrubs, its stones crumbling, the rope long gone. I stood there for a long time not knowing what to do. I didn't have a shovel. I didn't even know what I expected to find. Bones, a box, a confession written in something other than ink? But then I saw something that hadn't been there before. Just beside the well, barely poking out from beneath the dirt, was a shard of wood. At first I thought it was part of an old fence, but as I brushed away the earth with my hands, more of it appeared. A wooden plank. Then another. Nailed together crudely. A makeshift lid. My breath caught in my throat. I kept digging with my bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges and the way my fingers bled as I tore at the soil. The boards were loose, old. They came away easily. And underneath, a box. Worn, damp, rotting at the edges. I hesitated before touching it. Something in my body screamed at me to stop. Every instinct I had pulled back, but my hands moved forward anyway, like they were no longer mine. I lifted the lid. Inside was fabric. A child's dress, yellowed with age. Beneath it, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. A photograph, curled and water-stained. The image barely visible. 2 children, one slightly taller, the other smaller, both standing in front of the farmhouse. Both faces scratched out violently with ink or maybe something sharper. My hands trembled. I recognized the dress. I didn't know how, but I did. And suddenly, I remembered something I had buried in the back of my mind for years. A moment from when I was 6 or 7. I had found a box like this before. In the attic. I had pulled it out, opened it, and my mother had screamed. I had never heard her scream like that. She yanked it from my hands and slapped me hard. Then she locked herself in the bathroom for hours. She told me later it was just old junk. That I shouldn't go through things that didn't belong to me. But it wasn't junk. It was her. It was always her. I closed the box and backed away, the weight of it sinking into my chest like a stone. I didn't take it with me. I couldn't. I left it where I found it and walked back to my car in silence. The sun was setting. The shadows were long. And as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing beside the well. I could barely breathe as I watched the figure by the well from the rearview mirror. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the angle of the fading light or the trees casting shadows that looked like someone standing there. But the figure didn't move. Didn't vanish like a trick of the eye. It stayed. I blinked, squinting to get a better look. It was a girl. Her hair long and tangled like the woman in my dreams. The same posture, the same sadness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. She wasn't looking at me, but I could feel her eyes, those empty, accusing eyes, piercing right through the glass. I wanted to scream, to roll the window down, to reach out. But my body was frozen. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the knuckles turned white. And then she vanished. Just like that. No footsteps. No sound. Nothing. The road back to town seemed longer than it had before. Every bump, every creak of the car was amplified in the silence. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see her again. But the empty field behind me remained just that. Empty. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The girl by the well. The girl with the scar. The diary called to me. Not just in words anymore. In memories I couldn't explain. In feelings I hadn't known existed. I started piecing things together. My mother had been carrying a secret that wasn't hers alone. Something that involved Jonah, the girl, the well, and maybe even me. But the truth was slipping away. Like smoke in my hands. I needed answers. I reached out to the only person who might know something, my Aunt Claire. My mother's younger sister. The one who had always been a mystery to me. Claire had never liked to talk about family. At gatherings she'd smile politely, but her eyes held shadows I couldn't decipher. I hoped she might hold the missing pieces of this puzzle. I called her the next morning. Her voice was cautious, hesitant. When I told her about the diary, the well, the girl with the scar, she sighed deeply, a sound full of regret and pain. Some things, she said slowly, were meant to stay buried. But I insisted. I told her I needed the truth no matter how dark. After a long silence, she whispered, "You don't know what you're asking for. But if you want the truth, come visit me tomorrow. Alone." I agreed. Tomorrow I would face whatever ghosts our family had tried to keep hidden. Whatever secrets my mother had taken to the grave. And whatever darkness was still waiting, in the shadows. The next day dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that presses down on your chest before you even step outside. I drove through the fog that curled over the hills like a secret I wasn't supposed to know, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles whitened. Every mile closer to Claire's house, the weight inside me grew heavier, as if I was driving straight into a storm I could never outrun. Claire lived in a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town, a place I had visited only twice before, both times leaving with more questions than answers. She greeted me at the door with a hesitant smile, but her eyes were distant, clouded with memories better left untouched. The air inside smelled of old books and lavender, a faint reminder of the childhood I barely remembered. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one my mother and I had shared countless meals around, but it felt colder now, like a stage set for a play that was too painful to watch. I placed the diary and the letter between us, their edges curling like the lies I was desperate to peel away. Claire's fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the diary. "Your mother. She carried a burden that nearly destroyed her," she said softly, voice barely above a whisper. Jonah wasn't just a man from her past. He was a darkness that cast a long shadow over all of us. I leaned in, heart pounding, desperate for the truth she seemed reluctant to share. "She wasn't just afraid of him," Claire continued, eyes misting. "She was afraid of what he represented, the choices she made, the secrets she kept, and the consequences that followed." I asked about the girl with the scar. The one my mother mentioned but never named. Claire sighed, pulling a worn photograph from a drawer. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but it showed two girls standing side by side, one with a faint scar visible on her shoulder. "That's Lily," Claire said. "Your mother's daughter. Your half-sister." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Half-sister. A word I had never uttered, never imagined. The puzzle pieces shattered and scattered across the floor, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. "Lily disappeared when she was 6, Claire said, voice breaking. "No one knows what really happened. Some say Jonah took her. Others say your mother did something she could never forgive herself for. The truth is buried somewhere between the lies." Tears blurred my vision as I struggled to grasp the magnitude of the secret. The diary, the box by the well, the scar. It all pointed to a truth darker than I could have imagined. A family fractured by silence, haunted by choices no one dared to confront. I realized then that finding the diary was just the beginning. The real journey, one that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about my mother, my family, and myself, was only just starting. Leaving Claire's house, I felt like I was carrying the weight of every secret the walls around me had tried to swallow. The afternoon sun had faded into a dull gray as clouds thickened overhead, mirroring the heaviness settling deep inside my chest. Every step I took away from her door felt like stepping further into a labyrinth with no clear exit. Driving home, my mind replayed the photograph Claire showed me. A faded image of two girls, one with the unmistakable scar standing silently side by side. I kept wondering, who was Lily really? What kind of life had she lived? And how did her story intertwine so tightly with mine, with my mother's hidden past? I wanted answers. Desperately. But the town held its silence like a fortress. No one I knew ever mentioned a missing girl named Lily. It was as if she had been erased from everyone's memory, except the fragile pages of a hidden diary and the fading photograph now etched behind my eyelids. That night, I found myself wandering through old boxes in my attic, searching for anything that could connect me to the sister I never knew I had. Old letters, forgotten toys, anything that might whisper the story I was now desperate to hear. Among the dust and cobwebs, I found a small music box. I remembered it vaguely from my childhood, a gift from my mother. I wound it up, and the delicate melody filled the silence, bittersweet and haunting. Inside the lid, a tiny inscription, "For Lily, forever in my heart." A lump rose in my throat. The name was etched in my mother's handwriting, clear and tender. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the music box, feeling a connection to a girl I had never met but somehow already loved. The diary's words echoed louder now, the ache of a love lost, a secret buried, a family fractured. I knew then that I had to find Lily, to uncover the truth that my mother's silence had buried so deeply. No matter where it led me, no matter what I found. The morning after finding the music box, I woke up with a restless energy coursing through me, an urgency I hadn't felt before. The tiny inscription, "For Lily, forever in my heart," echoed in my mind like a secret chant. It was more than just words. It was a promise, a whisper of a past that refused to stay silent, a plea from a mother to her lost child. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lily's story was intertwined with mine, that the threads of our lives were tangled in ways I had no idea how to unravel yet. But one thing was clear: I needed to find her. I needed to know what happened to the sister I never knew I had. I spent hours combing through every corner of the attic, pulling out old photo albums, letters, and journals. I found pictures of my mother as a young woman, her smile radiant but tinged with sadness that the photos couldn't capture. There were postcards from places I'd never heard of, and letters written in hurried, sometimes barely legible handwriting. One letter caught my eye. It was addressed to someone named L. The ink was smudged, but the words were unmistakably filled with sorrow and hope. "My dearest Elle, I pray every day that you are safe, that you are free from the pain I caused. I don't know where you are, but I will never stop searching for the day we can be together again. You are my heart, my lost light." I held the letter tightly, tears blurring my vision. This wasn't just a diary or a hidden secret anymore. It was a lifetime of regret and love, buried beneath layers of silence and fear. Determined to find more, I turned to the internet. I scoured old newspapers, searching for any mention of a missing girl named Lily around the time Claire said she disappeared. Articles were scarce, but I found a few small blurbs, brief mentions of a child gone missing near the Hollow Creek Road farmhouse, cases that had gone cold, dismissed as another tragedy swallowed by time. I also reached out to the local police station, though I didn't expect much. The officer on the phone was polite but distant, reading off paperwork that barely scratched the surface of the case. "Records from that time are incomplete," she said. "But if you have any new information, please share it." I didn't. What could I say? That I had a diary, a letter, and a photograph no one else had seen? That I had visions of a girl with a scar who haunted my dreams? The answers wouldn't come easily. That night, I sat alone in my room, the diary open on my lap, the music box playing its soft, haunting tune beside me. I whispered to the darkness, "Where are you, Lily? Who are you really?" And for a moment I thought I heard a soft voice answering back. The days after my call to the police slipped by in a haze of restless nights and desperate searches. Every corner of my mind was consumed by the girl I'd never met, the sister I'd never known. Lily. Her name was a prayer and a curse, echoing endlessly in the hollow spaces of my soul. I started to keep a journal of my own, scribbling every scrap of information, every fragment of memory, every whisper the diary seemed to breathe into my ear. I wrote about the scars, the physical one on her shoulder, and the invisible ones that carved deep wounds into my family's history. I tried to piece together the puzzle, but every new revelation only tangled the threads further. One evening, as rain battered the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, I sat at my desk reading the diary again, searching for clues I might have missed. The pages felt heavier now, saturated with pain and secrets that screamed to be told. And then, buried deep in an entry dated almost 20 years ago, I found something new. A name. Evelyn. It was barely legible, written in a hurried scrawl in the margin. The sentence read, "Evelyn knows more than she says. But she's scared. So am I." Who is Evelyn? Friend? A relative? Someone connected to Jonah or my mother? Or worse, someone who had witnessed what had happened and had been too afraid to speak? I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was no longer just a family secret. It was a web of fear, lies, and protection, woven so tightly that no one could break free without getting hurt. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided to visit Claire again, hoping she might shed light on Evelyn. When I arrived at her house, the weight of what I was about to uncover pressed on me like a storm ready to break. Claire opened the door with a solemn expression, as if she'd been expecting me. She didn't ask why I was there. Her silence said everything. Inside, she led me to the living room and poured 2 cups of tea without a word. Then she finally spoke, her voice fragile yet steady. "Evelyn was my closest friend back then," she said. "She was the only one who knew what really happened that night Lily disappeared. But she was terrified, scared for her own life and for the family. That fear kept her silent all these years." My heart hammered. What did she know? Claire took a deep breath. She saw Jonah that night. Saw things no one else did. But when she tried to tell, she was silenced, threatened. She left town soon after, but I never stopped hearing her name whispered in the dark. In phone calls that ended abruptly. In letters that never arrived. Tears brimmed in my eyes. The silence that had held my family hostage was finally breaking, but the cost was still unclear. I asked Claire if she had any contact with Evelyn now. She shook her head. She disappeared too. Like Lily, but for different reasons. The room felt colder, emptier, as if the walls themselves mourned the losses hidden within. As I left Claire's house that day, I felt a chilling certainty. The truth I sought was tangled in more than just family secrets. It was locked behind fear, betrayal, and shadows that stretched far beyond what I'd imagined. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized how dangerous it was to uncover what had been buried for so long. The days that followed my visit to Claire felt like wading through a thick fog, each step uncertain and heavy. The names, the fragments, the whispered warnings, they all blurred together into a swirl of memories that weren't mine, yet haunted me as if they were carved into my very bones. I was no longer simply searching for a lost sister. I was unraveling a tapestry of darkness woven tightly around my family, a web of secrets so vast and tangled that I feared I might never find my way out. Every night I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of the diary heavy in my mind. I could almost hear my mother's voice, a fragile whisper slipping through the cracks in time, begging for forgiveness, for understanding, for release. But with every page I turned, the truth seemed to retreat further into the shadows, elusive and dangerous. I became obsessed with Evelyn, the mysterious figure my aunt had mentioned. Who was she really? What had she seen that night? And why had she fled, disappearing as completely as Lily had? The thought of her silence, born of fear and trauma, gnawed at me as if Evelyn held the final pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to complete. One afternoon I decided to visit the small town library, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed light on Evelyn's story. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood, a sanctuary of forgotten histories waiting to be uncovered. Hours passed as I sifted through archives, newspaper clippings, and dusty records, the scratches of my pen marking down every fragment of information that hinted at Evelyn's existence. I discovered an old article, barely a paragraph long, about a young woman who had abruptly left town shortly after a series of mysterious events involving the Hollow Creek Road farmhouse. Her name was Evelyn Harper. The article mentioned rumors of a scandal, but the details were vague, as if someone had deliberately erased the truth. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Evelyn's disappearance was no coincidence but a desperate escape from something far darker than I had imagined. And I wondered, was she still out there somewhere, living in fear? Or had the shadows finally swallowed her too? That night back home I pored over the diary again, my eyes weary but unwilling to close. I read passages I had skipped before, filled with coded references and half-hidden fears. My mother's words bled through the pages, raw and unfiltered, a confession wrapped in riddles. She spoke of broken promises, of a secret pact with Jonah, of a night stained with blood and silence. She wrote of guilt so heavy it crushed her spirit, of a love twisted into something unrecognizable. And through it all, the haunting presence of Lily, the sister I never met but whose absence screamed louder than any words. The realization hit me like a storm. My mother was a prisoner of her past, shackled by choices she could never undo. And I was trapped in the same prison, chained by the legacy of silence she left behind. The next morning, determined to press forward, I reached out to a private investigator specializing in cold cases. His name was Mark, a gruff man with eyes that seemed to see through lies and illusions. When I explained my story, he listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully. "We've got to start with the basics," he said. "Old records, witness statements, anyone who knew your family back then. Sometimes the smallest details crack open the biggest secrets." Together, we began piecing together the scattered remnants of a past long buried. Mark's connections opened doors I didn't even know existed. Old neighbors willing to talk, forgotten journals discovered in dusty attics, whispers of a confrontation between my mother and Jonah that had ended in violence. Each revelation was a shard of glass cutting deeper into my heart. But I couldn't stop. Because somewhere beyond the lies and the fear was the truth about Lily, about my mother, and about myself. And I had to find it, no matter what it cost. The days blurred into one another as Mark and I plunged deeper into the past, peeling back layer after layer of a story no one had wanted told. Every new name, every whispered rumor felt like a fresh wound reopening, raw and bleeding. But I had no choice. The silence was suffocating and I was drowning in questions I couldn't answer. One evening, Mark brought me an old diary he'd uncovered at a neighbor's house. It belonged to a woman named Evelyn Harper. My heart pounded as I turned its fragile pages, each word inked with fear, confusion, and a desperate hope for freedom. Evelyn's writing painted a stark picture of a girl caught in a nightmare, witnessing horrors no child should endure. She spoke of Jonah, not as a man but as a shadow, a predator who haunted their lives with cruelty and manipulation. Her entries detailed moments of terror and fleeting escapes, secrets kept behind locked doors, and a silent pact among those who suffered in silence. Reading Evelyn's words, I felt a chill creep down my spine. This wasn't just my mother's story, it was a shared nightmare, a collective wound past from one broken soul to another. And yet, Evelyn's diary ended abruptly, the last pages torn out, leaving her fate a haunting mystery. That night I sat alone, diary in hand, tears streaming as the weight of our fractured family pressed down on me. I realized that the scars we carried were more than physical. They were invisible chains binding us to a past that refused to let go. But amid the darkness, a small spark of hope flickered. Evelyn's words spoke of resilience, of a will to survive despite everything. And it was that hope that pushed me forward, fueling a determination to find her, to find Lily, and to finally break the silence. Because in uncovering their stories I might just find my own. The discovery of Evelyn's diary marked a turning point in this agonizing journey into my family's darkest secrets. For the first time, I held the raw, unfiltered voice of someone who had lived through the horror, someone who bore the scars of Jonah's cruelty not just in whispered rumors, but in the trembling, ink-stained pages before me. Every word she wrote was a desperate plea, a record of survival and silent resistance against a shadow that threatened to consume everything. As I turned the fragile pages, the diary felt less like a book and more like a living thing, pulsing with the pain, fear, and hope of a young woman trapped in a nightmare. Evelyn's handwriting was uneven, scarred by moments of panic, and her words painted vivid pictures of nights spent hiding, of whispered conversations behind locked doors, and of the suffocating weight of secrets shared between those who dared not speak. Her world was one I could barely imagine, yet the ache in her writing echoed a part of me I hadn't fully understood, the part that was afraid but stubbornly refused to be silenced. She wrote about Jonah in a way that twisted my stomach, a figure not just of menace but of control and cruelty. His presence was a poison seeping into every corner of their lives, turning love into fear, family into chains. Evelyn described him as a ghost haunting their steps, always watching, always threatening. She detailed the moment when she realized that speaking out could cost her everything, that silence was both her shield and her prison. The diary ended suddenly, the last several pages missing or torn away. It was a deliberate erasure, a final act of desperation, or perhaps a sign that the story was still unfolding somewhere beyond my reach. The absence was suffocating, a gaping hole in the narrative that screamed for answers I didn't yet have. I sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of what I had uncovered. Tears streamed down my face as I thought of Evelyn, trapped in a world where hope was scarce and danger was constant. Her bravery, hidden in these fragile pages, became a beacon in my own darkness, a call to keep pushing forward no matter how deep the shadows. Determined to find more, I returned to Mark with the diary in hand. Together we mapped out the fragments of Evelyn's life, cross-referencing names, dates, and places with other records. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. A timeline of fear and flight, of small acts of rebellion, and of desperate attempts to protect those she loved. One breakthrough came when an old neighbor came forward, recalling a young woman matching Evelyn's description who had left town abruptly after a confrontation with Jonah. The neighbor spoke of a late-night argument, voices raised and doors slammed, a final break in the silence that had held the community captive for years. As we dug deeper, Mark uncovered a clue that sent a shock through me. A letter addressed to Evelyn, never sent, hidden in a box of old family papers. It was from my mother. The letter was filled with regret and sorrow, words that spoke of mistakes and wishes to turn back time. She wrote of a promise to protect, to keep a secret buried to shield everyone from pain. But beneath the surface lay a raw confession of fear and guilt, of a love that was both fierce and flawed. Reading it, I felt closer to my mother than I ever had. The woman who had seemed so distant, so unknowable, was revealed in her vulnerabilities, her fears, and her desperate attempts to hold her family together even as everything fell apart. But the letter also left me with more questions. What was the secret she fought so hard to keep? How did it tie to Lily's disappearance, to Evelyn's silence, and to Jonah's shadow? And most haunting of all, was there still a chance to uncover the truth before it was lost forever? That night, I sat alone in my room, the weight of the past pressing down like a storm. I realized that this journey wasn't just about finding answers. It was about confronting the silence that had defined my family for generations, breaking the cycle of fear and reclaiming a legacy stolen by secrets. I whispered into the darkness, "I'm coming for you, Lily. I'm coming for you, Evelyn. I won't let your stories be forgotten." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt the stirrings of hope, fragile yet fierce, as I prepared to face whatever shadows awaited. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a thick fog, where every step was uncertain and every breath heavy with the past I was desperate to understand. Mark and I had become a team bound by a shared purpose: to pull the truth out of the shadows no matter how deeply it was buried. Every lead we chased, every name we uncovered, added to the tapestry of pain and resilience woven through the lives of my mother, Evelyn, and Lily. One rainy afternoon, as the sky wept quietly outside, Mark called me with news that sent a jolt through my veins. He had found an old woman who might have known my mother and Evelyn. The woman lived on the outskirts of town, a recluse with a reputation for speaking truths no one else dared to whisper. I met her in a small, cluttered house filled with the scent of herbs and memories. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, held stories of her own. When I showed her the diary and photographs, she nodded knowingly, her expression darkening. "They were brave girls," she said, voice rough but filled with respect. "Too brave for the world they lived in. Jonah. He was a storm no one could outrun." She told me stories I hadn't heard, tales of threats whispered in the dead of night, of secret meetings in hidden places, of promises made and broken. But amid the darkness, she spoke of a small glimmer of light, of a plan to protect Lily, a hope that someone would carry on the fight. As I listened, the weight of forgotten promises pressed down on me. I realized that this wasn't just my family's story. It was a story of countless others silenced by fear and pain, their voices lost to time. That night, I sat with the diary open, the pages worn but alive with memories. I understood then that my journey was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about honoring those who had suffered in silence, breaking the cycle and reclaiming the truth. I whispered into the dark, "For you, Lily. For you, Evelyn. I won't stop until the silence is broken." The rain had been falling steadily for days, turning the streets slick and the sky into a low, endless gray. It seemed fitting, an echo of the heaviness settling deep inside me, as if the weather outside mirrored the storm raging within. Each day felt like walking through a fog that thickened around every memory, every secret I was desperate to uncover, yet feared at the same time. Mark had become more than just an investigator. He was my anchor in the chaos. With his steady presence and relentless determination, he helped me navigate a past that had been deliberately buried beneath layers of silence and fear. Together, we pieced together fragments of stories, memories, and whispers that painted a picture far darker and more complex than I could have imagined. That afternoon, Mark handed me a thick folder filled with documents he'd gathered from a local historian and a retired police officer. Among the faded papers were detailed accounts of incidents that had never made it to the public eye: quiet disappearances, hushed threats, and the subtle but unmistakable influence of Jonah that stretched like a shadow over the entire community. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that what had happened to my mother, Evelyn, and Lily was part of a larger pattern of power, control, and silence. But amid the grim revelations, there were moments of unexpected warmth and resilience. Letters from friends and family members who had tried, in their own quiet ways, to shield each other from harm. Old photographs of happier times, where smiles masked pain and hope flickered beneath the surface. These fragments of light reminded me that even in the darkest places, there is a spark that refuses to die. One evening, after a particularly long day of research, I sat alone in my small apartment surrounded by stacks of papers and books. The diary lay open on my lap, its pages worn and stained with time. I traced my fingers over the faded handwriting, feeling a connection to the woman who had poured her soul into these words, who had fought against despair with every ounce of strength she had left. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered into the silence, "I'm here. I'm listening. I won't let your story be forgotten." In that moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for, a fragile sense of purpose, a quiet determination to carry forward the legacy of those who had suffered in silence. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time I believed that breaking the cycle was possible. I knew there would be more obstacles, more shadows to confront. But I was no longer alone. I had Mark by my side, and I had the voices of my mother, Evelyn, and Lily guiding me through the darkness. And as I closed the diary that night, I made a silent vow to seek the truth, to honor the past, and to fight for a future where silence no longer meant suffering. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and despair. Every new piece of information Mark uncovered felt like pulling at a thread that threatened to unravel the entire fabric of my family's history. I found myself caught in a tide of emotions, anger, sorrow, confusion, all tangled together like the dense forest around the farmhouse where so much had been hidden. One day Mark brought me a set of old audio recordings, voices captured in brittle tape from decades ago. They were interviews with neighbors, distant relatives, and even a few community leaders who had witnessed the slow unraveling of my mother's world. Listening to their voices, layered with hesitation and regret, was like hearing ghosts speak. They described a man named Jonah, not just a presence but a force that dominated and destroyed, leaving pain in his wake. There was one recording that chilled me to the bone, a woman's voice trembling as she recounted the night Lily disappeared. Her words were fragmented but haunting, a scream in the night, the sound of a struggle, then silence. The fear in her voice was raw, a tangible thing that seemed to seep through the speakers and wrap around me. After days of sleepless nights, I began to feel the weight of the past like a physical burden pressing down on my chest. I started questioning everything: the woman my mother was, the family I thought I knew, even my own identity. How much of who I was had been shaped by secrets I never knew existed? How could I reconcile the loving memories with the dark shadows lurking just beneath the surface? One evening, exhausted and overwhelmed, I sat by the window watching the rain fall, the steady rhythm somehow comforting. I whispered into the darkness, "I'm tired, but I can't stop. Not now." It was then I realized that the chains binding us were not just made of fear, but also of love twisted by pain. Breaking free meant facing the hardest truths, but also embracing the hope that lay beyond. With Mark's support, I vowed to keep going, to bring light to the shadows and finally give my family the peace they deserved. The deeper I delved, the more the edges of my world began to fray. Every truth uncovered seemed to pull at another thread, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of what I had always believed was my family. The diary, Evelyn's lost voice, the whispers from the past, they weren't just stories. They were echoes of a time steeped in pain, betrayal, and silence. Mark and I spent hours going over every piece of evidence, every faded photograph, every fragment of memory. But it felt like no matter how much we uncovered, the full story slipped further away, like shadows retreating from the dawn. One evening, as rain streaked down the windowpane, I found myself alone in the quiet house, the diary spread open on the table before me. I ran my fingers over the worn pages, tracing the words as if I could pull the past into the present. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I thought of Lily, the sister I never knew but whose absence shaped everything. I wondered what her life had been like, if she ever knew love or safety. The ache in my chest grew unbearable, a mix of grief and longing that no amount of answers could soothe. And then there was Jonah. His name a shadow that haunted every corner of our history. Who was he truly? A monster? A man broken by his own demons? Or something worse? A symbol of a darkness that had seeped into our family like poison? I knew I was close to something big. The pieces were there, scattered and fractured, but they were waiting to be put together. I just needed to be brave enough to face what the picture revealed. As the night deepened, I made a silent promise, to Lily, to Evelyn, to my mother, and to myself, that I wouldn't stop. No matter how painful, no matter how dark, I would find the truth. And finally I would be free. The days after that night of silent promises became a descent into a labyrinth of memories, half-truths, and shadows I never wanted to confront but could no longer avoid. Every thread I pulled revealed tangled stories of pain and resilience, secrets whispered in hushed tones, and wounds so deep they had been sealed away by time and fear. The diary, once a fragile object in my hands, had become a living testament to the fractured legacy that shaped me. A legacy of love, betrayal, loss, and a desperate fight for survival. Mark and I spent countless hours piecing together the fragmented puzzle, cross-referencing faded photographs, forgotten letters, and scattered documents that told stories both harrowing and heartbreaking. Each discovery brought me closer to understanding the complex tapestry of my family's past, but also further into the shadowed corridors of despair that had held us captive for decades. I found myself haunted by the voices of those long gone, my mother's trembling confessions inked on paper, Evelyn's whispered fears captured in a diary, neighbors' muted recollections from aged recordings. Their stories wove together a haunting narrative of a community silenced by the dark influence of Jonah, a man whose cruelty was etched into the very bones of the place we called home. His presence was more than a person. It was a suffocating force that poisoned relationships, shattered trust, and bred fear so deep that many chose silence over survival. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old belongings my mother had kept hidden away, I uncovered a stack of letters. Some addressed to Evelyn, others to a name I hadn't seen before, Samuel. The letters were filled with a mixture of sorrow, hope, and a longing for redemption. My heart clenched as I realized that these were the words of a woman torn between her past mistakes and her fierce love for her family, desperately trying to mend what had been broken. The name Samuel stirred something deep inside me. Who was he? A forgotten relative? A lost love? Or perhaps a key to unraveling the mystery that bound us all? Driven by a mix of dread and determination, I shared these new discoveries with Mark. Together we followed the trail, contacting distant relatives, tracing old addresses, and piecing together the story behind the name. It led us down a path fraught with unexpected alliances, betrayals, and a truth so profound it shook the foundations of everything I thought I knew. Nights became sleepless marathons of research and reflection. I found myself grappling not only with the facts but with the emotional weight of confronting a past riddled with pain and sacrifice. Memories surfaced, both mine and those passed down in whispers, that painted a portrait of resilience amidst despair. The women who came before me had endured unimaginable hardships, yet their spirits refused to be extinguished. In moments of quiet solitude, I would sit with the diary on my lap, reading the entries aloud, trying to hear the voices of the women who had fought so hard to protect what little they had left. Their courage became my compass, guiding me through the darkness. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that uncovering the truth was not just about finding answers. It was about breaking the cycle of silence and pain that had defined my family for generations. It was about reclaiming our story not as victims but as survivors. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, I stood by the window, staring into the fading light. The weight of what I carried was immense, but so was the resolve burning within me. I whispered into the gathering shadows, "I will find you, Lily. I will find you, Evelyn. I will find the truth no matter the cost." And with that vow, I stepped forward, into the abyss, into the unknown, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, ready to face whatever darkness awaited. The search was no longer just about uncovering a story. It was a reckoning. With every new clue, every whispered testimony, I could feel the walls of silence and fear that had held my family captive beginning to crack. But the weight of generations of secrets was heavy, and those cracks threatened to collapse the fragile structure of the past we had built. Mark and I pushed deeper into the tangled web. We uncovered letters hidden in unexpected places, behind loose floorboards, tucked inside old books, folded within photo albums. Each letter was a fragment of a story, a piece of a puzzle that spoke of love, betrayal, courage, and fear. Some were written in haste, others painstakingly detailed, but all carried the unmistakable mark of desperation. One letter, penned in my mother's shaky handwriting, revealed a plan, one last attempt to protect Lily. It spoke of a hidden place, a sanctuary she hoped would shield her daughter from Jonah's shadow. The location was vague, but the hope it represented ignited a fire within me. We followed the clues to an abandoned farmhouse nestled deep in the woods, a place whispered about in old town tales but forgotten by most. The air was thick with the scent of decay and memories long buried. As I stepped inside, the weight of history pressed down like a physical force. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the past to be remembered. In a dusty corner beneath a loose floorboard I found it, a small weathered box. Inside were letters, photographs, and a faded locket, the very same music box inscription I had found months ago. It was a tangible connection to the past, a symbol of love and loss intertwined. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the locket, feeling the presence of those who had fought and suffered before me. It was more than a keepsake. It was a legacy, a promise that I was not alone. That night, as the wind howled outside, I wrote in my journal, "The silence is breaking. The truth is alive, breathing beneath the surface. For Lily, for Evelyn, for my mother, I will keep fighting. Their stories will not be forgotten." The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The past was coming to light, and with it the chance for healing. The discovery at the farmhouse felt like a breakthrough, a beacon cutting through the suffocating darkness that had long surrounded my family's past. Yet, as with every step forward, I quickly learned that uncovering the truth was as treacherous as it was necessary. The letters and photographs in the box painted a picture both heartbreaking and illuminating. My mother's handwriting traced stories of love fiercely guarded, mistakes painfully acknowledged, and a desperate hope for redemption. Among the letters was one from Lily herself, something I never expected to find, a delicate note penned with the tentative hope of a child who had been lost but not forgotten. The realization shook me to my core. Lily wasn't just a ghost in our family history. She was a living, breathing person who had fought her own battles, hidden in the shadows but yearning to be seen. Mark and I spent days carefully analyzing every word, every faded image. We discovered references to places I'd never heard of, safe havens my mother had tried to reach, people she'd trusted with secrets too heavy to carry alone. One name appeared again and again, Sarah. According to the letters, Sarah was a friend, a confidant, someone who had stood by my mother in moments of fear and doubt. But Sarah's whereabouts were unknown, lost to time and silence. Determined, we began searching for Sarah. The trail was cold, but with the help of local records and some persistent calls, we finally found a lead. A small town several hours away where an elderly woman named Sarah had lived for decades. The thought of meeting someone who had shared my mother's fears and hopes filled me with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. What stories would she tell? What truths would she reveal? Could she be the key to unlocking the final pieces of this long-buried puzzle? The journey to Sarah's town was long and quiet, filled with the kind of restless hope that comes when the past begins to bleed into the present. As I drove, I rehearsed what I might say, what questions I might ask, but deep down I knew some truths could only be revealed in silence, in shared glances, and in the weight of a lifetime's memories. When I finally stood at Sarah's doorstep, heart pounding and hands trembling, I understood that the next chapter of this story would change everything. The drive to Sarah's small town stretched endlessly through winding country roads, framed by dense forests and fields tinged with the muted colors of late autumn. The sky hung heavy with clouds, threatening rain, but the storm outside felt nothing compared to the turmoil roiling within me. I clutched the steering wheel, my thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and apprehension. Who was this Sarah? What had she witnessed? And more importantly, would she be willing to share the truths she had kept hidden for so long? I thought back to the letters Mark and I had pored over, the ones filled with whispered fears and desperate hopes, penned by my mother and by Lily. Sarah's name appeared like a beacon through the darkness, the only constant in a sea of uncertainty. She had been my mother's closest confidant, the person she had entrusted with the heaviest secrets, the truth about Jonah, the plan to protect Lily, and the unbearable weight of silence that had suffocated our family. When I finally arrived in the town, it was the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten. Small brick buildings, a solitary main street, and a lingering quiet that felt both comforting and unsettling. Mark had tracked down Sarah's address, a modest house near the edge of town, surrounded by towering oaks and the rustle of fallen leaves. I sat in my car for a long moment, gathering my courage. The house looked unassuming, its windows framed by lace curtains, but I sensed the weight of history trapped inside those walls. Knocking felt like a small act of defiance against the silence that had held us captive for so long. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly woman whose eyes shone with a sharpness that belied her age. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly, and her posture was straight but tired. For a moment neither of us spoke. I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, as if she had been waiting for me without knowing it. "Are you?" I started, my voice trembling. "Yes," she said softly, stepping aside. "Come in. I've been expecting you." Inside, the house was warm but filled with the scent of old books and memories. Photographs lined the walls, black and white images of faces I could only imagine were from another life. She motioned for me to sit by the fireplace, and as the flames flickered, she began to speak. Her voice steady but carrying the weight of years of secrets. Sarah told me stories that no letter could fully capture. Of nights spent comforting my mother as she wrestled with guilt, of whispered plans to keep Lily safe, and of the community's quiet complicity in maintaining the silence. She spoke of Jonah not just as a man, but as a symbol of the darkness that had gripped our lives, a force so pervasive that fear had become a survival mechanism. Her words painted a vivid picture of resilience amidst despair, a network of women who had banded together, shielding each other as best they could. But even their strength had limits, and the cost had been unbearably high. As she spoke, tears welled in my eyes. For the first time, I felt the full weight of the legacy I carried. The love, the pain, the sacrifices made in shadows I was only now beginning to glimpse. When she reached the part about Lily, her voice cracked. "She was brave," Sarah whispered. "Braver than any of us. And she never stopped fighting." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I need to know everything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "I need to understand who she was, and who my mother was." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then we have much to talk about." For hours, the stories unfolded, filling in the gaps the diary and letters had left behind. The past came alive in vivid, painful detail. Secrets buried in the soil of that old farmhouse, promises made in whispers, and the enduring hope that truth would one day set us free. As the night deepened, I realized this meeting was not just about uncovering history. It was a bridge, a connection between generations, a chance to heal wounds that had festered in silence for far too long. When I finally left Sarah's house, the world outside felt different, both heavier and lighter at once. The path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time I felt that I was no longer alone in this journey. And that gave me the strength to keep going. Leaving Sarah's house, the crisp night air filled my lungs with a strange mixture of relief and dread. The stories she shared had lifted a veil, revealing truths that had long been hidden but also opening wounds that hadn't yet begun to heal. I could feel the weight of my family's history pressing on me, but for the first time, that weight felt like a call to action rather than a burden. Back home, Mark and I spent endless hours piecing together everything we'd learned: diaries, letters, photographs, recordings, and now Sarah's memories. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking yet oddly empowering. A family fractured by fear and silence, yet united by an unbreakable thread of love and resilience. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations: Lily's courage, my mother's sacrifices, Evelyn's silent battle, and Sarah's unwavering support. But one question still loomed: what truly happened to Lily? Was she alive, lost, or had her story ended in tragedy? As I stared at the diary again, I noticed a hidden envelope tucked into the back. A letter addressed to me. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, my mother's handwriting trembled with emotion. "If you are reading this, then the past has finally found you. I have tried to protect you from the darkness that consumed us, but it is time for you to know the whole truth. Lily's story is not over, and neither is ours. Seek the place where it all began, the old orchard behind the farmhouse. There you will find what has been hidden for too long." The message was clear: a final clue, a promise, and a challenge. The orchard. The place where the shadows had taken root, and where, perhaps, the truth waited to be unearthed. With Mark by my side, I knew the journey was far from over. But whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. For Lily. For my mother. For Evelyn. For myself. The time had come to confront the past, once and for all. The old orchard behind the farmhouse was a place frozen in time, branches gnarled and bare, leaves long since fallen, and a silence so thick it felt like it swallowed every sound. As Mark and I stepped through the gate, the weight of years pressed down on me, the air heavy with memories and unspoken truths. The ground was uneven beneath my feet, scattered with broken glass, rusted tools, and forgotten remnants of a life that had been abruptly shattered. Each step forward was a step closer to the heart of the mystery that had haunted me for so long. My hands trembled as I searched among the roots and weeds, desperate to find whatever my mother had hidden here. And then, beneath a twisted tree trunk, I found it. A small weathered box, locked tight but worn from the years. The lock gave way with a quiet snap, revealing inside a collection of letters, photographs, and a journal. My mother's final words, her confessions, and her hopes. As I unfolded the letters, tears streamed down my face. The pain, the love, the regret, all spilled forth in a flood of raw emotion. My mother wrote of her love for Lily, the terrible choices she'd made, and the sacrifices forced upon her by fear and circumstance. She revealed the truth about Jonah, his cruelty, his hold over the family, and the ultimate act that had torn us apart. But amid the sorrow was hope. Hope that I would find peace, that the cycle of silence could finally be broken, and that our story could be told, not as victims but as survivors. Mark stood quietly by my side as I read, his presence steady and reassuring. When I finished, I looked up at him, the weight lifting just a fraction. "This is more than a story," I said. "It's a legacy." The journey had changed me. It had uncovered the darkest parts of my family, but also the strength that endured despite it all. I was no longer just a seeker of truth. I was a bearer of that truth, tasked with carrying it forward. As the sun began to rise, casting light across the orchard, I felt a sense of closure, and a new beginning. For Lily. For my mother. For Evelyn. For everyone silenced too long. I whispered into the morning air, "Your stories will live. I promise." And with that I stepped forward, no longer burdened by the past but empowered by the truth. I never imagined a voice could live inside silence. But that's what happened with Lily. Even after everything, after the letters, the diary, the photographs, the orchard, Sarah, I still wasn't prepared for what it would feel like to sit alone in my apartment and hear my sister's voice for the first time. Mark had digitized an old cassette that had been tucked between layers of letters in that final box we found at the farmhouse. It was unmarked. No date. No label. Just a brittle old ribbon of magnetic tape that might have seemed meaningless to anyone else. But when I hit play, I stopped breathing. The voice on the recording wasn't confident or loud. It was soft. Careful. It sounded like someone speaking in the dark, unsure if the walls would listen. But there was Lily. My name is Lily. And if you're hearing this, it means someone kept this safe. Maybe someone who still remembers. Maybe someone who still cares. Her voice cracked. My hands did too. I felt like I was falling backward in time, into a room I'd never seen, sitting across from a sister I'd never met, and realizing she had never given up hope. Not really. She spoke of the day she left. Of the fear. Of the pain. Of the resolve. I didn't run because I was weak. I ran because no one else would. I ran to live. I didn't run because I was weak. I ran because no one else would. I ran to live. And if I make it far enough, maybe I can come back. Maybe someone will find me. Maybe my story won't disappear like so many others did. I paused the recording halfway through. I couldn't go on. Not yet. The weight in my chest was too heavy. The silence that followed her voice was louder than anything I'd ever heard. How many years had this tape been waiting? How long had her story been sealed in plastic and cardboard, stored beneath rotting wood and mold and time? She'd spoken directly to someone, anyone who might listen. And now I was that person. I had become the one she hoped for. And that realization shattered something inside me, but it also forged something new. Because this was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was about answering her call. About becoming her voice now that she couldn't speak anymore. I pressed play again. Her voice returned. Stronger. Steadier. She ended with a line that etched itself into my bones. "Don't let them forget me. That's all I ask." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I just sat there, clutching the tape, listening to her over and over again until I could repeat her words by heart. "Lily, I won't forget. None of us will. I didn't run because I was weak. I ran because no one else would. I ran to live."